Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf, which is Eruvin Daf Mem. We have 6 lines from the top of the Amid. Says the Gemara, Hu lifta? There was this turnip shipment, the Asr Maseches, which arrived at the town of Maseches on Yom Tov itself. Maseches was the place where Rava lived. Nafak Rava. So Rava went out to have a look. Chazio de Chmisha. He noticed that it was slightly shriveled. Shara Rava lemizbeh b'nei. As a result of that, Rava allowed them to purchase from these turnips. Why? Amar, he said, Ha vadai me'ismael nekro. This certainly has already been uprooted from yesterday. What's the gain and benefit of that? Explains Tosfos. Because had it been attached still on Yom Tov, meaning at the onset of Yom Tov been a shmashes, it was still attached to the ground, that would render it muktzah for the entire Yom Tov, because it's inaccessible at the beginning of Yom Tov. Therefore, Rava ascertained that it was already picked from yesterday. By the fact that it was shriveled, that indicated that it wasn't fresh, and therefore he allowed them to pick, to buy from these turnips, because there was no concern of muktzah. Continued Rava. Okay, so that concern is out of the way. My amris. So what then are you going to say? There's another concern. Because it was delivered from outside the tchum. And we know that when a malacha is done by a goy for the sake of Yisrael, Yisrael cannot partake, cannot benefit from that hana, from that malacha. So likewise, when something was delivered from outside the tchum, Yisrael cannot enjoy it. Says Rava, but this is different, because the issue of tchum is the Rabbanan, and a special leniency applies here. Hababish Yisrael, when something was brought from outside the tchum for the sake of this specific Yisrael, for the sake of Reuven, muta lechel Yisrael achar, and Shimon can eat it. So certainly in this case, it's okay. Why? Certainly in this case, it was delivered for the sake of Goyim. Therefore, the Yisraelim certainly can have benefit from this delivery. So that was phase 1 of the story. What happened next? Kiv and the Chaz, once Rava saw, he noticed the Goyim increased and brought more because they had an abundance of customers. So now he saw that they were bringing for the sake of the Yisraelim. Asalu, he disallowed it. He didn't allow them to purchase any longer, because now it's clear and evident that they're bringing it from outside the Tchum for the sake of Yisrael, and therefore they can no longer have enough from it on Yom Tov. Hanu b'nei Genana, there were these individuals who would craft these canopies for the sake of the Chasanim, and one of the elements of this canopy was the Hadas. They would include Hadassim. So what happened? The Gazaluhu also b'Yom Tov Sheni. Goyim cut for them, they picked for them Hadassim on the second day of Yom Tov. L'urta sharalu Ravina l'ruche be'la alter. So Ravina allowed them to smell the Hadassim immediately after Yom Tov, right at nightfall, without even waiting that additional time which is generally required when a malacha is done for the sake of Yisrael on Shabbos or Yom Tov. You need to wait. Enough time has to pass that allows for this malacha to take place on Yom Tov. For instance, in this case, to allow for the Hadassim to have been picked on Matzah Yom Tov, what happens then is that the Yisrael is not really benefiting from the malacha which was on Yom Tov. But rather than require them to wait, Ravina allowed them to smell it immediately after Yom Tov, without waiting. How can you do that? You should not allow them, because they're not b'nei Torah, not learned and knowledgeable fellows, not really committed to Torah. There's a concern that if you apply this leniency, they will take it a step further. They'll be mezalzel, they'll neglect when it comes to your halachas of Yom Tov Sheni. Therefore, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't show them this kula. You shouldn't apply this leniency. Now, it appears that Ravina's approach was either because it was Yom Tov Sheni, so you could be more lenient, or, as Ritva explains, because this hadas is really meant to be inserted in the canopy. That's its primary method of benefiting from it, primary use. So since they're just merely smelling it outright, which is not its ikar hana, therefore he didn't require them to wait b'chtei sheyasu. So Rava challenged them. Rava Batachlifa says, well, they're not Bnei Torah. You meant to be more strict. Continues the Gemara. Maskeflo Rav Shmaya. So Rav Shmaya took issue with the wording of Rava Batachlifa. Time with the Bnei Torah. You're only concerned because they're not Bnei Torah. Ha Bnei Torah Shari. But otherwise, if they would be Bnei Torah, you would allow it? You would be okay with it? Meaning that strictly, halachically, it would be mutter? That's not the case. Even in this case, we require that they wait. Enough time needs to elapse, which would allow for this malacha to take place on Matzah Yom Tov. This avoids them having anah from the malacha that was done on Yom Tov. So even Bnei Torah have that mandate. Says the Gemara, Azlu Shailu L'Rava. So I want to ask a Shaila of Rava. What is Allah here? Amar Lucy told them, indeed, yes. You need to wait, even in this case, the amount of time in Shiyasu, Matzah Yom Tov, in order to have anah from the Hadas. So Mishnah related to us that Rabbi Deisa ben Harkinas would say as follows, that the Oivel Fnei HaTeva, the Chazan, who would stand in front of the Aron Kodesh, on Rosh Hashanah, he would say two things. First of all, Hachlitzei Hashem Elokeinu, strengthen us on this day of Rosh Chodesh. So he would mention Rosh Chodesh, although it was Rosh Hashanah. Number two, he would say, Im Hayoim Im Lamachar. Whether Rosh Chodesh, meaning Rosh Hashanah, is really today, so strengthen us today, or perhaps it's tomorrow. So he would daven conditionally. And the next day he would say the same thing, whether it's today, whether yesterday, because there was a suffix, which day is really the Rosh Chodesh, which day was really Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara and the Mishnah ends with the words of Lo Yehoid Lo Chacham. Chacham did not agree to him. And the question is, what were they opposed to? He included two elements in his statement. Number one, that you mentioned Rosh Chodesh or Rosh Hashanah. Perhaps that they were opposed to. And number two, that you do it conditionally. Whether it's today, whether it's tomorrow, perhaps that is what they had a problem with. So which one was it? Let's see the Gemara. Amar Rabba ki avinan be Rav Huna. When we were at the yeshiva of Rav Huna, Iboilan, we had the following shaila. A general question. Ma'u lahaskir shorish chodesh Rosh Hashanah. Is one meant to make mention of the occasion of Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah? What are the two sides of this equation? Says the Gemara, on the one hand, given the chalukin b'masaf, and I'm reading, since Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah have their own independent karbanos musaf, so tefillah we know is meant to be instead of the karbanos, so we're meant to mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah to correspond to their respective karbanos. Or perhaps, no, there's no need to mention Rosh Chodesh. Zikaron echad oila l'kan l'kan. The fact that you're saying as Yom HaZikaron, as a day of remembrance, that can be applied to Rosh Chodesh as well, which is also considered to be a Yom Zikaron. Let's take a look at Rashi, 6 lines from the top. Kivan the chalukim b'musafim. Shemakriven musaf Rosh Chodesh, musaf Rosh Hashanah. We have two types of musaf, Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah. The pasuk is describing the carbon of Rosh Hashanah. This is in addition to the carbon of Rosh Chodesh. So that will lead us to believe that we're meant to make mention of both things. Amrina b'tefillah nami. Esayim HaShachodesh to address Rosh Chodesh. Esayim HaZikaron to address Rosh Hashanah. On the other hand, perhaps Zikaron Echad can be applied to both. Esayim HaZikaron that we mention on Rosh Hashanah applies to both. The Rachmana carries Zikaron, the Chsiv Zichron Trua, so it applies to Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Chodesh Nami Ksiv. We find elsewhere the pasuk attributes the concept of Zikaron, remembrance, to Rosh Chodesh as well. So perhaps just mentioning once as Yom HaZikaron can also include Rosh Chodesh. There's no need to mention Rosh Chodesh. Or as the Rambam and Pirush HaMishnah explains, we're not meant to mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. The pasuk describing Rosh Hashanah says, "Tiku b'chodesh shofar b'keseh leim chagenu." It's a chag that the Yoreach, that the moon is covered up. It's unseen. It's the beginning of the month. It's b'keseh. Therefore, perhaps we're not meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh at all. So, do we mention or do we not mention? That was the question which was posed to Rav Huna. Amar Lan, so Rav Huna responded, Tani Suah. We learned about this in our Mishnah. It seems like there's a machlekes. And the Chachamim hold we're not meant to mention Rosh Chodesh. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Doisa Omer, Oyov Ne'ateva V'chulu. My love lahasker. So we now propose that the machlekes in our Mishnah, meaning the Chacham did not agree. What were they opposed to? Perhaps they were opposed to the fact that he mentioned Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. My love lahasker. Shall we not assume that the machlekes is pertaining to the question of mentioning Rosh Chodesh? It's unrelated to that. All agree what is meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh. The machlekes is the disagreement was revolving around the question of the Tanai, which Rabbi Doisa stipulated. He's meant to say, maybe it's today, maybe it's tomorrow. The next day he'll say, maybe it's today, maybe it was yesterday. That is what the Chacham disagreed with. One is not meant to make a condition during his davening, as we'll see soon. Therefore, it's unrelated to mentioning Rosh Chodesh. All agree, perhaps, that is meant to be mentioned. Hachinam mistaver. It's actually pretty apparent that this is the correct pshat. Because in addition to the machlekes found in the Mishnah, we found the same machlekes in a brayse, mediktane bebrayse. V'chein haya Rabbi Doisa oisa b'rosh chadashim shal kol hashana kula. He applied the same thing to your standard Rosh Chodesh throughout the entire year. And they didn't agree with him. Now let's analyze. It appears that the same discussion they had in our Mishnah pertaining to Rosh Hashanah also applied to the other Rosh Chadashim throughout the year. And they didn't agree with Rabbi Doisa. Says the Gemara, so it's all good and well if the machlekes revolved around the Tanai. That's why they didn't agree with him. Not on Rosh Hashanah, nor on the standard Rosh Chodesh. But according to you who maintain that the discussion in our Mishnah on Rosh Hashanah revolved around the question of whether one is meant to mention Rosh Chodesh. That was the question. And that leads us to assume that when the Brisa says V'chein hoyer Rabbi Doisa, he would apply the same thing to Rosh Chodesh. It was also pertaining to the same discussion. So why didn't they agree to Rabbi Doisa when it comes to Rosh Chodesh? Why shouldn't you mention Rosh Chodesh on your standard Rosh Chodesh, which is not Rosh Hashanah? This proves that the discussion revolved around the Tanai, and indeed that applies to Rosh Hashanah and to your standard Rosh Chodesh equally. Says the Gemara, okay, so the Gemara responds. So what are you saying? That the machlekes revolves solely around the question of Tanai. Meaning, according to myself, I agree that there's a machlekes regarding Tanai. But there were actually two discussions. One is regarding that stipulation of the condition, which applies to Rosh Hashanah and to your standard Rosh Chodesh. But in addition to that, I maintained that when it came to the discussion now, Mishnah, that also pertained to the question of whether one is meant to mention Rosh Chodesh or not. So according to me, there were two separate discussions here. But according to you, there's only one single solitary issue. That's a Tanai issue, which applies to Rosh Hashanah in the Mishnah, which applies to Rosh Chodesh in the Brisa. That's the case. Why that repetition? Why did they need to have two separate machlekes revolving around the same topic? It's superfluous. It's unnecessary. It's sricha, says the Gemara. Yes, indeed. They're both needed. The Ashmin Rosh Hashanah, because if only the Rosh Hashanah machlekes would be mentioned, the one in our Mishnah, Havamina, perhaps I would say, Bahal Kami Rabbanon. It's only over here that the Chachamim hold Bahal Kami Rabbanon Deloy. They hold that one is not meant to make that tonight. Why? Because it can lead to pitfalls. It can lead to a person neglecting and not taking Rosh Hashanah seriously. If you make that tonight and you say, well, maybe it's today, maybe it's tomorrow, the person will say, it's suffix anyways, let me do malacha. So perhaps it's only by Rosh Hashanah. If we would only have the Mishnah, perhaps I would say it's only by Rosh Hashanah with the Chacham are more strict. But when it involves your standard Rosh Chodesh throughout the entire year, where it's not asur b'malacha, there's no concern of a person doing the Savera, perhaps they would agree to Rav Doisa that one is meant to be precise and accurate when it comes to daven. As Rabbi Yonason says, the reason why Rav Doisa mentions this tonight is because a person shouldn't look like he's being meshaka b'tfilasa. It shouldn't look like he's being untruthful. One is meant to be accurate and precise and truthful. So perhaps when it comes to your standard Rosh Chodesh, which does not entail this concern of a person being mazalz and doing malacha, perhaps over there Rabbanan would agree to him. Yes, we're meant to make that tonight. So when we have 2 days Rosh Chodesh, we want to show which is the real one. So on either one, we're meant to say, perhaps it's today, perhaps it's tomorrow, and do that tefillah, conditionally. So that's why we need to have that brayso which teaches us no. Even when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Chacham disagree. They hold one is not meant to make his tefillah on condition, because even there's a concern, perhaps of zilzal, perhaps a neglect saying Hallel, davening Musaf. Continues the Gemara, v'yitam b'ha. Now, if we would only have the second brayso pertaining to your typical Rosh Chodesh, I would say perhaps b'ha kam Rab Doisa. It's only over there Rab Doisa tells us to do the tonight because it doesn't involve a pitfall doing malach. Aval bahach, but when it comes back to the question of Rosh Hashanah, perhaps Rab Doisa would agree to Rabbanan. One shouldn't get himself involved in stipulating conditions. Perhaps it can lead to zilzah and malacha. Tzricha, that's why we need both machlokes. We need the Mishnah, which tells us that even by Rosh Hashanah, there's a machlokes, and Rab Doisa holds, we're meant to make that tonight. As Rabbi Yonasan says, one's meant to be truthful. And that perhaps apparently, according to Rish, that overrides the other consideration of zilzal. We need this Mishnah. We need the Brisa as well, which teaches us, even when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, Chum disagree with Rav Doisa. One is not meant to make that condition. Perhaps that can also lead to zilzal, to neglect of Musaf, of Halal. So if we need both contexts, we need the context of Rosh Hashanah and the context of Rosh Chodesh. In both cases, we have the same machlokes. So according to this, up until this stage in the Gemara, the machlokes only revolves around tonight. But certainly when it comes to the question of whether one is meant to mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah, it appears, yes, the right way to do it is to mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah. Says the Gemara, is that the case? Meisvei, we have a kashma brisa, which seems to indicate otherwise. Rosh Hashanah shecholis b'Shabbos. Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos. Beishama oimrim mispalel eser. How many brachas are contained in the Shemona Esrei of this Musaf? The joint Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah. Beishama say 10 brachas. Ubesil oimrim mispalel tesha. 9 brachas. Let's see Rashi. 10 lines from the bottom. Mispalel eser. How do we get to 10? Shalish Rishonis, V'Shalish Achronis. So we have your standard first 3 brachas of Shemona Esrei and the last 3 brachas of Shemona Esrei. V'Shal Shabbos B'fnei Atzma. Then you have the bracha which describes Shabbos. That's an independent bracha. Harisheva. So now you have 7. Ukdushas Hayom V'Koilu Malchis. Now you have to add another bracha in honor of Rosh Hashanah. Kedushas Hayom. In that is included the psukim of Malchis. Harish Shmoyna, now we have 8. Another 2 brachas are V'Zechronis V'Shofros, the brachas which have the psukim of Zechronis V'Shofros. So for a total of 10. So Shabbos would require 7, 3 in the beginning, 3 at the end, and 1 in the middle. Because it's also Rosh Hashanah, we add another bracha. According to Beis Shammai, we're meant to mark Rosh Hashanah by adding a separate bracha for the sake of Rosh Hashanah, which includes Malchus, as discussed in Maseches Rosh Hashanah. Why? And then we add another 2 Zechronis and Shofros. So we have a total of 10. Ubesil oimrim mispalel tesha, only 9, because we include both together. The koil Shabbos v'Yom bracha achas. We still don't require a separate bracha for Yom Tov. It appears that according to Basil, we include the mentioning of the lower level day, Yom Tov, which is lower than Shabbos, in the bracha of Shabbos, which is a higher level, a more prominent day. So we don't need a separate, independent bracha for Yom Tov, for Rosh Hashanah in this case. The koil Shabbos v'Yom Tov bracha achas v'chaisem, and he concludes the bracha by saying Mekadesh HaShabbos v'Yisrael v'Yom HaZikaron. So he references Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah. So according to Beis Shammai, we need a separate bracha for Rosh Hashanah. According to Basil, we don't. We include it in Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. V'im Isa. Now, if you maintain the proper way to do it is to mention Rosh Chodesh separate from Rosh Hashanah, it requires its own mention. Beis Shammai achas esrei mibayle. If that's the case, then you should need to add another bracha for Rosh Chodesh as well, which will give us a total of 11 according to Beis Shammai. Let's see Rashi, 3 lines from the bottom. V'im Isa, the mask of Rosh Chodesh. If you mention Rosh Chodesh separately, in addition to Rosh Hashanah. Lebeis Shammai, according to Beis Shammai, the boy l'chol chad bracha fnei atzmo, that each thing requires a separate bracha. Yud alvin boile. He should require 11 brachas here. So you have your standard 7, 3 and 3, and the one in the middle for Shabbos. You have another one for Rosh Hashanah, and another one for Rosh Chodesh, plus the Zecharos and Shofars for a total of 11. So this seems to be a raya. No, we're not meant to mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah, and therefore it doesn't get its own bracha. Says the Gemara, Amar Abzera, not so quick. Although generally speaking, perhaps you are meant to mention Rosh Chodesh independent from the mention of Rosh Hashanah, but it doesn't earn its own bracha. Rosh Chodesh is not your Yom Tov. Let's remember, Rosh Chodesh is like a weekday. It's not a Yom Kaddish, not also B'Seis Malacha. It's somewhere in between a Yom Tov and a ordinary weekday. There's no Issa Malacha, there's no Kedusha, but it has Karban Musaf. So what happens? So what happens on your standard Rosh Chodesh, which falls out during the week? So of course you make mention somewhat during Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv. You say Yalav Yavai, but you don't give it its own bracha. It's only Musaf they need to make, because Rosh Chodesh has a Karban Musaf, and there's no Karban Musaf during your ordinary weekday. So you add that Tfilas Musaf for the honor of the Karban Musaf. But during Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv, you only make mention. You only make a mention of the occasion by saying Yalav Yavai. Now, being that that's the case, so likewise, when Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos, what happens? You don't designate a new bracha for Rosh Chodesh when it comes to Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv. At most, you include it. You include it in the bracha of Shabbos, that middle bracha of Kedushas Hayom of Shabbos. You'll make mention of Rosh Chodesh as well, because Rosh Chodesh doesn't really generate its own bracha. It's not a yontiv which requires its own bracha. You include it in the bracha of Shabbos. Says Rav Zera, since that's the case, that Rosh Chodesh doesn't really generate its own bracha by Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv, therefore even when it comes to Musaf, where certainly you're meant to mention Rosh Chodesh more prominently, we see that during an ordinary weekday, Rosh Chodesh generates its own Tfilas Musaf. Even so, when it falls out on Shabbos, it doesn't get its own bracha. It's included in the bracha of Shabbos. That explains why, although you're meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh on this Rosh Hashanah that fell on Shabbos, make mention of it. It's important. You can't neglect it. You can't include it in the mention of Rosh Hashanah. But it won't generate its own bracha. That explains why, according to Beis Shammai, you don't add another bracha due to Rosh Chodesh. Let's see inside. On Reb Zera, Shani Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is different. It's different than your standard Yom Tov. Metoich shekoil is Shachas v'Arvis. Since when it comes to the Shachris or the Arvis of Shabbos, you just included your koil. You included in the bracha of Shabbos. It doesn't earn its own bracha. Koil now b'Musafin. Likewise, when it comes to Musaf, you only include it, rather than create a new bracha for the sake of Rosh Chodesh. So at this point in the Gemara, certainly you meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh, even Rosh Hashanah, but to generate its own bracha, that it will not do. Says the Gemara, "Umi islu Beis Shammai koil." Is that the case? Meaning you're basing your reasoning here on the precept that Rosh Chodesh is always included in the bracha of Shabbos, even when it comes to Musaf. Is that the case? That according to Beis Shammai, Rosh Chodesh doesn't garner its own bracha? We have a brayta which tells us otherwise. U'mi'islu Beis Shammai koil? Do Beis Shammai agree with this concept of koil? V'atani, we listen to the brayta. Rosh Chodesh cholis b'Shabbos. What happens when Rosh Chodesh falls down on Shabbos? Beis Shammai oimrim mispala shmoina. You add another bracha for Rosh Chodesh. So when it comes to Musaf, you have your standard 7 brachas for Shabbos, right? The 3 first brachas of Shemona Esrei, 3 last ones, and the middle one for the sake of Shabbos. According to Beis Shammai, you don't ignore Rosh Chodesh, you give it its own bracha for a total of 8 brachas. With Salayim Rispal Sheva, you only daven 7, meaning according to Beis Hillel, as we mentioned earlier, you include the lower level commemoration within the higher level Zikaron. So in this case as well, you include mentioning of Rosh Chodesh within the bracha of Shabbos. It doesn't need its own bracha. But in any case, we say according to Beis Shammai, when it comes to Musaf of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh gets its own bracha. So why, when Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbos, did we not add a new bracha for the sake of Rosh Chodesh? If we meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh, it should have its own bracha. The more kasha, indeed, it's difficult. This would seem to indicate that Rosh Chodesh is not meant to be mentioned in Rosh Hashanah, and therefore it doesn't have its own bracha. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. It's around halfway down the column here, 30 lines down. It says Rashi, Umiyas l'Beis Shammai koil, b'birchas hamosav. Do Beis Shammai subscribe to this concept of koil? B'mirchas hamosav and Rosh Chodesh ikul b'Shabbos, when it pertains to the bracha of Rosh Chodesh by Musaf, if it falls on Shabbos. We know that's not the case, because the Brisa clearly tells us that if Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbos, you add another bracha of Rosh Chodesh. You don't include it in the Shabbos bracha. Mispal Shmoina, Shor Rosh Chodesh, B'Shol Shabbos, U'B'Musaf and Ka'amar. It's more kasha, indeed, it's difficult. Ushmamino, indeed, we hear from here. Kivan the B'Shar Shabbosis, Kol Bo Beis Shammai bracha Rosh Chodesh. Since we see, generally speaking, on your standard Shabbos, Beis Shammai do require a special bracha to be composed for Rosh Chodesh. Uber Shoshana loy bo. Nevertheless, when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, they don't require that. So we see from here the Tama Mishum Dezekara and Rosh Hashanah Oidoloi. Apparently, it's because Rosh Chodesh doesn't need its own mentioning on Rosh Hashanah. The Zikaron of Rosh Hashanah is applied to Rosh Chodesh as well. Ushmamina. And we conclude from here, Afilu Michlale Ve'atkuri Namale Be'inan. We don't even need to include it or to mention it, because the Zikaron of Rosh Hashanah is applied to Rosh Chodesh as well. Continues the Gemara. So we just mentioned the side point earlier that Rosh Chodesh is meant to be included when it comes to Shabbos. It's going to be included during Shachas, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Within that bracha, within that middle bracha of Shabbos, you also make mention of Rosh Chodesh. You don't just suffice with saying Ya'aleh v'Yaveh. Says the Gemara, actually, it's based on a Machlokes Tanaim. What you meant to do. V'koil atzmai Tanai, this concept of including Rosh Chodesh that falls down on Shabbos, including it in the bracha of Shabbos by the tefillas of Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv. It's actually Machlokes Tanaim. The Sanya Shabbos shechol yeis b'Rosh Chodesh or b'Chodesh Shel Moed. If Shabbos falls out together with Rosh Chodesh or Chodesh Shel Moed, so what do? Arvis Shacharis and Mincha Mispal Kedarkei Sheva. So you daven as usual those 7 brachos, the 3 in the beginning of Shemona Esrei, 3 at the end, and the one in the middle for the sake of Shabbos. And you only make mention of that occasion of Ya'aleh v'Yaveh during the bracha avodah, which is Ritzei. The Shita holds that the point of mentioning Rosh Chodesh is on account of its carbon. So where does it belong? The bracha avodah. We mentioned it during the bracha of Moedim, just like thanking Hashem on Chanukah and Purim, Al Nisim. Likewise, when it comes to Rosh Chodesh or Chodesh Moed, it's a time of thanksgiving. We mentioned the Ya'aleh v'Yaveh during the bracha of Hodah. Okay, so according to this approach, we don't include it in the bracha of Shabbos. We wait either to the Ritzei or to Moedim, and we just say Ya'aleh v'Yaveh. V'loi Amar. If you omitted Ya'aleh v'Yaveh, Machzir and Oisei, we require him to go back and daven again. Of course, this doesn't apply to Ya'aleh v'Yaveh on Rosh Chodesh at night, as the Gemara, Tosfos, and Bracha say, because the Kiddush HaChodesh was not done at night, establishing of the new month. Therefore, if a person leaves out Ya'aleh v'Yaveh at night on Rosh Chodesh, he doesn't need to go back. But it applies to the other situations. So in any case, according to this approach, which is Tanna Kama and Reb Lezer, on Shachas Mincha Ma'ariv of your Shabbos Tefillah, you don't even include Rosh Chodesh or Chodesh Shel Moed inside that bracha. It's not important enough to be included in the bracha of Shabbos. You only make a trivial mention of it. You say Ya'aleh v'Yaveh. That's regarding Shachas Mincha Ma'ariv. Uba Mesafin, where you meant to highlight Rosh Chodesh and Chodesh Moed. Why? Because they have their Chi of Musaf. Okay, so when it comes to Musaf, you bump them up a step. Maschel b'Shel Shabbos, in this case you mention them within the bracha of Shabbos. Maschel b'Shel Shabbos. So that middle bracha of Shabbos, you begin by referencing Shabbos. U'Mesayim b'Shel Shabbos. and you conclude with Shabbos. And you make mention of the Rosh Chodesh or the Chol Hamoed in the middle of that bracha. Okay, so this is Tanakama's opinion that other than Musaf, you won't really include mention of Rosh Chodesh or Chol Hamoed within the actual bracha, within that middle bracha of Shabbos. Only Yalav Yavi said. Rav Shimon Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel Bnei Shabrechem Broikaim, they say no. We're meant to make more significant mention of Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed. Kol Makam Shezakak L'Sheva. Whenever you have those 7 brachas on Shabbos, meaning even Shachris Mincha Maariv, you're meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed. Maschil b'Shal Shabbos. Indeed, you begin by referencing Shabbos. U'Misayim b'Shal Shabbos. That bracha includes with Shabbos. V'Omer Kedushas Hayom be'emtza. And you do mention Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed in the middle of that bracha. So according to them, even when it comes to Shachas Mincha Maariv, you're meant to include, meant to make reference of Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed within that bracha, within that middle bracha, which is said in honor of Shabbos. Let's stop for just a moment. So in summary, when it comes to Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed, so when it comes to a ordinary weekday, so we know Shachos Mincha Maariv, we just say Yalav Yavi. There's a question of whether you say it by Avodah or by Hodah. And when it comes to Musaf, certainly we're meant to compose a bracha, a tefillah Musaf, for the sake of Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed. When it falls on a Shabbos, we have machlekes. So when it comes to Shachos Mincha Maariv, according to Tanakama, all you say is Yalav Yavi. According to Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel Bnei Shabrechem Broikaim, you're meant to make more prominent mention. You include it in the bracha of Shabbos. When it comes to Tefillas Musaf, all seem to agree that a prominent mention needs to take place. Therefore, according to Beis Shammai, you actually compose a new bracha. You are moist of a bracha for the sake of Rosh Chodesh or Chol Hamoed. Whereas according to Beis Hillel, you include it in the bracha of Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. My Havila. So what was the conclusion regarding the question of whether you mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah or not? Amar Rav Chizda, you do not mention it. Why? Zikaron echad. The one mentioning of Zikaron, when you say Es Yoma Zikaron Hazeh in reference to Rosh Hashanah, that already includes, that's also applied to Rosh Chodesh, which is also described as Zikaron. Zikaron echad. So it would appear, according to this conclusion, that the Chum disagreed with Rav Doisa. They hold that one is not meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. So conclusion, we have 2 machlekes between Rabbi Doisa and the Chachamim. One is regarding mentioning Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah. According to Rabbi Doisa, yes. According to the Chachamim, no. Another question is regarding stipulating that condition on Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Chodesh by saying, perhaps it's today, perhaps it's tomorrow. According to Rabbi Doisa, we do that because we're meant to be precise and accurate in our wording of our tefillos. Whereas according to Chachamim, they're concerned perhaps it may lead to a zilzal, a pitfall. One may neglect Rosh Hashanah, may do malacha, one may neglect Rosh Chodesh, omit halal musaf, due to the fact that it's only a suffix. Therefore, they maintain, better don't discuss any conditions, just daven straightforward and outright. Continues the Gemara, V'amar Rava. So this is in addition to the previous question which was posed by Rava at the Yeshiva Rav Huna regarding mentioning Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. Rava is going to pose for us another question which was mentioned at the Yeshiva Rav Huna. V'amar Rava. Ki avinu beRav Huna. When we were present at the Yeshiva Rav Huna, Iboilan, we also had the following question. Ma'olei mar zman. What is the halacha regarding making the bracha of zman, which is the bracha of shechiyonu, v'kiyimonu, v'giyonu la'zman hazeh, thanking Hashem for giving us the opportunity to live and to see this occasion? What is the halacha regarding making that bracha b'Rosh Hashanah or b'Yom Kippurim? Is it meant to be said then or not? What are the 2 sides of the equation here? On the one hand, kiven the mizman l'zman asi, since it arrives from time to time, it's a once-a-year event. Amrinan, that is sure reason to make the bracha. Oidimo, perhaps, kiven the le'ikru regalim, since although they're Yom Tovim, but they're not really classified as regalim, which is a term unique, specific to the Shalosh regalim, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, which are times of simcha and joy, as opposed to Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, which are more solemn and serious occasions. In fact, the Gemara tells us elsewhere that the Malachim complained to Hashem, how come Bnei Yisrael don't say Hallel during Rosh Hashanah and Kippur? And Hashem responded, how do you expect them to say Hallel at a time when the Sifrei Chaim, the Sifrei Mesim are open before me? It's a time of Yira, of Pachad. It's not a time of Hallel. So perhaps since Rosh Hashanah and Kippur are not considered regalim, not considered to be especially joyous and happy events, Lo Yamrina, therefore we don't say Zman, which is specific to a time of joy and happiness. So, are we meant to say Zman or not? Lo Yahava B'yadei, Rav Huna didn't really know what to respond. Ki Asoi B'Rav Yehuda, when I came to Rav Yehuda and I presented him the question, Omar, he responded with certainty, yes, of course. You can make the bracha. I'm not myself. Akroch chalata nami. Amin Zman. Even on a new pumpkin, the new pumpkin of the new crop of the new year, I also make the bracha of Shechianu. It brings me joy and happiness. I mark the occasion with the bracha of Shechianu. In fact, that's the halach when we see fruit of the new year. We're meant to make the bracha. The minhag is to wait until we eat it. But just the sighting of that new crop is considered to be an occasion enough for the bracha of Shechianu. Therefore, he said, of course, Rosh Hashanah and Kippur are considered to be significant enough occasions where you can make the bracha of Shechianu. Amri Leis, I told Rav Yehuda, Rishus Leikum Boili. I have no question whether a person is allowed to make the bracha Shechianu. Certainly, one can make the bracha. The question was regarding Chiyuv. Is one obligated? Kikim Boili Chayiv Amai. What is the halacha regarding the Chayiv? Is one obligated to make the bracha of Shechianu on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur or not? Amar Leis, he told me, Rav Shmuel Damar Tavai, they both said, Ein Omer Zman, Ella b'shalosh regalim. The chiyuv of Shechianu only applies to the shalosh regalim. If you'd like, you can make the bracha even in Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, or when you see that new fruit. But the chiyuv only applies to these three especially happy and joyous occasions of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Says more, is that the case? That we don't make a bracha of Shechianu, we're not required to make the bracha during Rosh Hashanah and Kippur? Meisvei, we have a brayso which indicates otherwise. The Brayso quotes a pasuk in Kelis, Tein chelek l'shiva, v'gam l'shmoina. You're meant to separate a part of the 7 and a part of the 8. What does that mean? Rav Lezer Omer, Shiva elu, Shiva yimei bereshis. The 7 days of creation, we're meant to separate a portion of that. That's referring to Shabbos, the 7th day of the Yimei Bereshis. What is the Shmoina referring to? Shmoina elu ches yimei Mila. Referring to the 8 days of Mila, meaning that the 8th day of those 8 days of Mila is meant to be designated as day of Mila. Rabbi Shua Omer, he has a different approach. Shiva, when the pasuk says Tein chelek l'shiva, he meant to offer something to Hashem. During 7, what is that referring to? Shiva elu, Shiva yimei Pesach. Throughout the 7 days of Pesach, he meant to offer something to Hashem. Shmoina elu, Shmoina yimei Achag, the 8 days of Sukkot. The pasuk says, Ten chelek l'shiva v'gam l'shmoina. What is that coming to include? L'rava is to include atzeres, which is Shavuos, for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So you see that according to Rabbi Yeshua, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur are included in the same category as the Aliyah Yom Tovim. My love Lizman. So when I propose that we're speaking about the chiyuv of bracha of Shechianu, and apparently applies to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur as well. So bracha. We're not speaking about the chiyuv of Shechianu, rather the bracha that one makes to mark the Yom Tov, Mekadosh Yisrael V'Azmanim, during davening, during Kiddush. That's what the Rosh is referring to. But when it comes to Shechianu, there's no chiyuv to recite Shechianu or Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Hachinam mistaver. This indeed seems to be the correct approach. Because, shall we say that the Rosh is referring to the bracha of Shechianu? If that's the case, Zman kol shiva mi'ika. Since when do we recite Shechianu 7 days in a row? Rosh says that whatever this is applies to the 7 days of Pesach, 7 days, the 8 days of Sukkot. We only say Shechianu once at the onset of that period. So apparently he's not speaking about Shechianu. So kasha. That wouldn't be a kasha. He doesn't mean that one is meant to repeat Shechianu 7 days in a row. Although he's referring to Shechianu, he simply meant to say like this: if you didn't get a chance to make the bracha right now, meaning on the first day, you have the opportunity to make the bracha tomorrow or the next day to make it up. That's all he meant. And during the 7-day unit, 7 days of Pesach, 8 days of Sukkot, you still have the opportunity, anytime throughout that period, to make the Shechianu one time. So if that's the case, Rishon can be speaking about Shechianu, and indeed, he can be indicating for us that Shechianu is meant to be said on Shani Yom Kippur as well. Says the Rabbi, you can't say that. Why? You can't say. Find it hard and difficult to say that Rabbi Shua is speaking about the bracha of Shechianu, which is going to be said throughout the 7 days of Pesach if he hadn't said in the beginning. Because the Gemara is assuming a person doesn't have a cup of wine past the first day of Pesach, past the first day of Sukkot, when Kiddush is required. So how can you propose that he'll say Shechianu later on during the Yom Tov, but Inam Kais? The Gemara is assuming that a cup of wine is needed when one makes Shechianu to add chashiva significance to the bracha. So how can a person make Shechianu throughout the Yom Tov when he doesn't have a cup of wine? Says the Gemara, Leima Messiah Rav Nachman. So perhaps this is a writer of Nachman, meaning your suggestion that one has the ability to say the bracha of Shechianu all throughout the 7 days of Pesach, even though he doesn't really have access to a kosh shel yayin. Perhaps this is a writer of Nachman. The Amar of Nachman, Zman, the bracha of Shechianu, Ohimrei afilu b'shuk. One has the ability to say it even out in the marketplace. He has no access to a kosh of wine. So is this a writer of Nachman? Says, well, not necessarily. Halei kasha, because this question that you asked, where's the cup of wine? That's not a kasha. We're speaking about a case, the ikale kais, that a cup of wine has become available to him, sometimes throughout the other days of Pesach, which allowed him to make the bracha of Shechianu, because certainly a kashol yain is a prerequisite for the bracha of Shechianu. Says the Gemara, okay, hateinach atzeres Rosh Hashanah. So you understand how we can make the Shechianu on a cup of wine during Shavuos or Rosh Hashanah. Well, let's remember, the Brisa also makes mention of a Shechianu in honor of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippurim heichi avid. How is he meant to proceed making the Shechianu over a cup of wine? If he's standing Erev Yom Kippur, right before Yom Kippur, he takes a cup of wine, he makes a bracha on it, Shechianu, Hagafen, v'shasile, and actually drinks it. That's problematic. He can't do that. Kivad Amar Zman, because once he has already said Zman, the bracha of Shechianu, Kibli alei v'asale. He's already accepted upon himself the Kedusha of Yom Kippur, which results in Isser. He can no longer drink that wine. As we find elsewhere in the Gemara Brachas, regarding Kedusha Shabbos, once a person accepts upon himself Kedusha Shabbos, even if it's still Friday afternoon, the halachas of Shabbos apply to him. The Amalei Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abel Rav. This was an incident where Rav davened the Tefillah of Shabbos early, and Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abel turned to him and he said, "Mi badlas? Have you separated yourself, refrained from doing malach?" V'amalei, he said, yes, badilna, I've already separated from malachas. So we see that accepting upon oneself the Kedusha brings with it all the halachas. So in this case, once he has already said Shechianu v'kimanu azman hazeh, he has already accepted upon himself Kedusha Yom Kippur, which doesn't allow him to drink the wine. So who's going to drink the wine? Livra chalei v'linche. Okay, so let's say he makes the bracha and he just leaves it. He can't do that either. Hamavarach tzarich sheyitay. One who makes a bracha needs to actually taste it. Says the Gemara, lisva linuka. Okay, let him give it to a child who has not yet come of age to observe Yom Kippur. You give it to him to drink. Now, although this person who made the bracha personally won't drink the wine, that's okay. As Rashi will explain for us, because the point of tasting the kosher bracha is to honor the kos, because by just leaving it alone is a neglect, is a zilzal on the kos. So as long as anybody drinks it, even this katan, that's okay. Says him, okay, so that's an option. He won't drink it, but the katan will. Says, well, that's not an option. Why? Less hilchas Rav Acha. Allah doesn't follow Rav Acha, who allowed elsewhere. Tosfos brings it to Gemara and Shabbos. In a similar situation, Rav Acha allowed the katan to do something which was asur for the gadol. We won't allow the katan to do it. Why? Dilma asal misrach, because it's concerned that he might continue with this practice even when he gets older. He'll become accustomed to drinking this cup of shechiyana wine on Yom Kippur. Therefore, we can't allow the katan to drink it. So in conclusion, nobody will have the ability to drink this wine. So how can he go make shechiyanu over a cup of wine in honor of Yom Kippur? So it appears, according to this conclusion of the Gemara, that indeed there's a riot. The fact that the Gemara interpreted that the Bryce is referring to making the bracha of shechiyanu even on Shani Yom Kippur, that implies that a kais is not necessary in accordance with Shidduch Nach. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. He explains for us this whole concept of the tasting kosher bracha, several lines from the bottom. Says Rashi, Leisvili Yinuka L'shtaisai. Why can't we serve this Yom Kippur wine to the child? After the adult makes the bracha. Now, although we just learned in the Gemara, which indicates that the person himself, the person who made the bracha, he needs to partake in the wine. Says Rashi, it's not necessarily so. The Haishiyita de Ka'amar, love dafka ka'amar mavarach. It's not necessarily applying to the person who made the bracha specifically. Tu adin kishase achrina. The same thing would apply if somebody else drinks it. That's okay. Because why is it necessary to actually drink from this kais, the taima, mishum the gnai hu kosher bracha? It's a gnai. It's dishonorable for the kosher bracha shelo yen adam menu la'alter. If nobody partakes from it immediately, which will result in the bracha of hagafen being useless and not being really applied. Therefore, one is meant to drink from it, but anybody could drink it. As long as somebody else tastes it, that's okay. Now it's interesting, Rashi applies this reasoning to the bracha of Boyer Pri Hagafen as well. Now the kasha here is, it's a brachas hanenin. It's a bracha which is said prior to having anah from something. Generally speaking, a person can't make a brachas hanenin, for the sake of somebody else. He himself must have anah. And for Rashi, it seems that there's no concern of bracha of atala here. A person can go ahead and make the bracha of hagafen, even though he personally is not drinking the wine. The concern is only because it's a gnai for the kosher bracha, therefore somebody must drink it. Now what happened to the simple concern of the bracha of atala? He's making hagafen, not drinking. Says the Beis Meir. Apparently Rashi holds. Now in this case there's no concern of bracha of atala, because although hagafen is a brachas hanenin, which requires hana, enjoyment, he's having hana. He's using this wine, although not for drinking purposes. He's using it for the bracha of shechiyanu. He's using it for the kosher bracha. So therefore he can make the hagafen, even though he's not actually going to drink it. There's another concern. The kosher bracha needs to be drunk. Somebody else will drink it. Continues Rashi. Kedisani nami, as we find likewise in the Brisa, the Gemara, the Perek Ru'u Bezdin, which is Rosh Hashanah, we find a similar case where one person makes a bracha and another person drinks it. Or we're speaking about food here. The Gemara says a person should not slice the bread, meaning make the bracha of on behalf of his guests, unless he himself partakes in the meal. Sharei and Yichel and Lasa is because they themselves have the ability to make the bracha. Aval Persul Abanam Lebeisa, he can go ahead and make the bracha for the youngsters in his home. Mitzvahs to train them to do mitzvahs. Even though he himself is not going to eat that bread, Ella Banav, only his children are going to eat. Shapidami, that's okay. Even though he made the bracha and they ate, that's okay. Says the Gemara, so why can't we do this? Why can't we feed it to the child? Says the halacha doesn't follow Rav Acha, who would allow such a thing. Says Rashi, Rav Acha bar Yaakov le'isparish. Rashi is not sure where we have this shita, and actually Tosfos points to a Gemara Shabbos where we seem to have Rav Acha bar Yaakov shita, who would allow doing this with a cotton. So Gemara concludes we can't allow the cotton to drink. Why? Dilma asal misrach, says Rashi, asal misrach hatinik la'achar haminag zeh. He might be drawn after this custom, and continue drinking this kais of shechiyanu even after he becomes a gadol, in which case he needs to fast. Therefore, we won't take chances, and we won't give it to a cotton due to this concern. Let's take a look at Tosfos here. 4 lines from the top. Dil masal misrach. Says Tosfos, the concern only applies in this type of situation. It's only when it comes to this scenario of the bracha of shechiyanu, We don't want to give it to the child. Shu kavua, it's something which is standard, which is a fixed thing. It happens year after year. Chashin, we're concerned, Dilmasal Misrach. Perhaps if he gets accustomed to doing it, he might continue even during his adulthood. Aval, im ira bris mila. Let's say a bris happened, betesbav, oy b'mekipurim. It's something just occasional. It's a random occurrence. It's not something which happens on a steady basis. In that case, we're not concerned. If we feed the wine to the child, the kais, which we use by the bris, we feed it to the child, that he'll continue doing so when he gets older, because it's something which is only an occasional occurrence. In fact, there was a chuppah which took place on Asar B'Tevis, a fast day. They offered the kais to the child because it's not something which is a recurring occurrence, and therefore there's no concern of Asal Misrach. Continues the Gemara, 7 lines from the bottom. My Havela. So what was the conclusion regarding the question of Rabbah? Is there a chiv to make a shechiyanu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? Says the Gemara, Shadru Rabbanan l'Rav Yemar Saba. So the Rabbanan sent Rav Yemar Saba, Kamed Rav Chizda, before Rav Chizda, B'mal Yoyim Adrei on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Amalei told him, Zil, go ahead, Chazi, take a look, Hechi Avid Uvd, how he conducts himself, Toimalan, and come back and relate it to us. Says the Gemara, Ki Chazi. Rav Chizda noticed his new guest. Amar Lewis, he turned to the ones next to him and he said, what's he doing here? There must be a reason why he arrived. Dal Yua L'Retiva, he employed a metaphor. Dal Yua L'Retiva, a person picked up a wet board. Apparently he's not using it for firewood. Rav Salei Beduchte, apparently there's something hidden underneath. So there's a reason why he arrived. He's coming to observe, he's coming to learn. And he realized what he was coming to learn. Indeed, they brought before Rav Chizda a cup of wine, Kaddish. So he made Kiddush for Rosh Hashanah. V'amar zman. And he said the bracha of Shechiyanu to indicate, indeed, that there's a chiv. To say Shechiyanu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. V'ilchasa, indeed, the halacha is as follows, Omer zman Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim. One is obligated to say Shechiyanu on both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. V'ilchasa, likewise, the halacha follows the Shita of Rav Nachman, zman Oimroi afilu b'shuk. One has the ability to say the bracha shechiyanu even out in the marketplace without a cup of wine. So in summary, regarding the bracha shechiyanu, so we learned that if one does it rishus, arbitrarily, he can do it even on a pri chadash. But regarding chayva, that applies to shalosh regalim, to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Gemara concludes he can do it even without a kais. We also learned that if one missed the opportunity to make a shechiyanu at the beginning of Yom Tov, you can always make it up tomorrow or the next day, as long as it's within that 7 or 8 day Yom Tov period. Here, time for a brief review of today's daf. The Gemara began relating to us 2 incidents. In the first case, there was a shipment of turnips that arrived to Mechayza on Yom Tov. Rabbi decided that it was picked before Yom Tov, there's no concern of muksa, and therefore he allowed it to be purchased by Yisraelim. Then when he saw that they increased their shipments for the sake of the Yisraelim, he no longer allowed it to be purchased because it's being brought from outside the Tchum for the sake of Yisrael. In the second incident, the Goyim picked some Hadassim on Yom Tov Sheni for the sake of the Yisraelim. The Gemara concluded they must wait after Yom Tov is over a sheer amount of time that theoretically would allow enough time for these things to be picked. This way they're not having a nah from the malacha that was done on Yom Tov. We discussed mentioning Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Hashanah within davening. We have machlekes V'sham B'Silil. V'sham hold that one is meant to assign a separate bracha. So even if it falls out on Shabbos, you're meant to make a special bracha for Rosh Chodesh, for Rosh Hashanah. Whereas B'Silil hold went included within the bracha of Shabbos. The Gemara related 2 separate questions that were asked in the yeshiva of Rav Huna. In the first question, there was a shaila whether we're meant to make mention of Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. And this evolved into the discussion of the 2 machlekes, the 2 disputes between Rav Doisa and Chachamim in our Mishnah. Number 1 was whether or not we mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. According to Rav Doisa, yes. According to Chachamim, no. Second question was whether we employ a condition when we daven. We say, well, maybe it's today, maybe it's tomorrow. This question applies to Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Chodesh. According According to Rabbi, they say yes. According to Chachamim, no. And the Gemara concluded that we're not meant to mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah in accordance with Shittas Chacham. The second question was regarding the bracha of Shechiyanu. Is there a chiyuv to say it on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? And the Gemara concluded, yes, indeed. We're meant to say it on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur just as we say it during the other Yom Tov.